Welcome, friends, to Beyond the Crucible, the podcast that dares to talk about setback and failure, but not so we can commiserate. It's so we can elevate. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and our mission today is to offer you the hope that your crucible experiences, those challenges and trials you've faced in the past or are facing right now, do not define you. They refine you. They did not happen to you. They happened for you. And I've said it before. I'll say it again. I'll keep saying it as long as we have this show. I don't know many people, folks, who know all those things I just talked about better than the founder of Beyond the Crucible, the host of this program, and my friend Warwick Fairfax. Warwick, we are back doing an episode about a blog that you wrote, and it's been a while. It's been since, if I check my math here, it's been since June 25th. Since we've done one of these. So we've had a robust conversation about what we're going to talk about. You were very passionate about the blog, so I think this is going to be a very helpful conversation for folks.
Yeah, I think it really will be, and definitely looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, and it is, folks. This is the first one of these dialogue episodes off a blog that Warwick has written since June 25th. And that's because we had that fabulous summer series that we enjoyed very much on classic films, classic Crucible lessons, where we unpacked Warwick 9 movies and the lessons you could learn about bouncing back from the Crucible from those. So that was our summer rhythm. Now we're back into our normal rhythm. So this blog, Warwick, which is at beyondthecrucible.com, is called "How Can You Avoid a Professional Identity Crisis? Do some soul work." So that's what we're going to talk about here today. So Warwick, what led you to write this blog about the importance of avoiding identity crises when it comes to our professional pursuits? In some cases, what we see as our callings. What was it that prompted you? This was what you wanted to write about this time.
You know, Gary, we had 2 recent podcast guests. In fact, it was within a space of a week. And they'd both launched businesses and initiatives that they were off the charts passionate about.
Right.
And they ended up getting out of it. But what amazed me was they did not have their identity wrapped up in what they do and what they did. And it wasn't like they didn't care about this initiative. They were absolutely 100% all in. They felt like this is important. This is going to make a difference. It wasn't like, yeah, I'm making widgets and who cares? Oh, they absolutely passionately cared about it, but yet their identity wasn't in what they did. And it's so unusual. And I've had lots of conversations with lots of folks. I've read about lots of people, and it's really, really unusual not to have your identity wrapped up in what you do. And so it just kind of like floored me, astounded me. It's like, how is this possible? And so what it did was it caused me to reflect on my own journey. And my story, as listeners know, was different in many ways. But I grew up in a 150-year-old family media business. In Australia, I was seen as the heir apparent by my parents. It was founded by my great-great-grandfather, John Fairfax, again, 150 years ago in 1841. In 1987, after my dad died, I launched this $2.25 billion takeover of the company to change management, to bring the values and the vision of the company back to the vision of the founder. At least that was my perspective. And 3 years later, in 1990, the takeover ultimately failed spectacularly, and the company went into bankruptcy and fell out of family control. And so, you know, I prepared my whole life to go into the family business. Did my undergrad at Oxford, worked on Wall Street, got my MBA at Harvard Business School. You know, I was all in. My whole sense of self, my whole identity was being a Fairfax, and in particular, trying to carry on the legacy from my dad, who I dearly loved, and my great-great-grandfather, John Fairfax. It was a great vision, a great organization that cared for people, that cared about the nation of Australia. How could you not want to go into that kind of company and that kind of vision? So I was all in, but my whole sense of identity, who was Warwick Fairfax? I was, at least from my parents' perspective, the heir apparent. I was the next generation. My education, my business experience, it was all to fulfill a role that I felt like I was born into and was my duty. So my identity was 100% wrapped up in what I did. not because it was so much all about me. It just felt like this was my duty. So who was Warwick? Warwick was, the great-great-grandson of John Fairfax, the son of my father, Sir Warwick Fairfax. And, people were expecting me to do this. And I felt like it was my duty. So my experience was so different than these two recent podcast guests. It just got me to reflect an awful lot. It's like, wow, this is not my story, not having your identity wrapped up in what you do. And after the company went into bankruptcy and passed from family control, my identity was really hit hard. Sometimes after a business that you put your heart and soul into goes bankrupt, or you leave that venture, there's a huge test of your identity. Who am I if I'm not CEO, I'm not the founder of this business? And it was not easy. Those years in the 90s, especially early 90s, were tough. Why were they so tough? Because my identity was 100%, certainly in some ways, involved in the family business.
Yeah. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, folks. Stay tuned, because Warwick doesn't, right? He said just a little bit ago, he said that his identity was totally wrapped up in being the next, in being the heir apparent, being the man in line for taking over John Fairfax Limited. And, that caused some troubles. He'll explain where he's at now with the things that he does now. So after we go through who the podcast guests were and what they taught us, so the lessons Warwick's learned, he's going to tell you a little bit more about how he's applied those lessons in his own life to help you apply those lessons in your life. So let's talk about those two recent podcast guests whose comments astounded you. I've heard you express your reactions to guests and to things that you've read and things that you've heard. Astounded isn't a word that you throw around very, very frequently. So that they really, truly had an impact. And one of and because they had those two things in common, or that thing in common that you just mentioned, they didn't let their identity in what they didn't draw their identity from what they did. There's something else I just have to say. I'm going to tease it, that they have in common. They're both from Australia. So, again, two more guests from Australia, which is great. Truly, they were great guests. But they are the second thousandth, I think, guest we've had on us from Australia on the show so far. We had two guests from Wisconsin, and I was one of them, but I'm not bitter at all. But let me ask you seriously, Warwick, what was it that they said that their demeanor and their words that did astound you? Why were you astounded?
So let's talk about these guests. The two guests were Stephanie Woolard and Jason T. Smith. Stephanie is an Australian woman, and she founded this venture called 7 Women. And the goal of 7 Women is that it equips and empowers thousands of women from Nepal who are marginalized by their society. I mean, an incredible woman. Go listen to our podcast episode on Stephanie Woolard. You'll hear the story of how she was on a sort of a tour of Nepal. I don't know if it was an eco tour, and she sort of wandered off and just saw this woman that was had some physical challenges. She was living in a tin shed, basically, with 6 other women, a total of 7 women, all of whom had challenges, and that really birthed this whole 7 Women organization that's helped thousands of women and empower them and equip them. It's an incredible story. And then we also talked to Jason. Now, his story was different, but he is also Australian, and he founded the Back in Motion Health Group. And that was Australia's largest physiotherapy network. It supported more than 140 franchisees with a team of more than 700 employees. And Jason sold that business in 2020 for $100 million. Now, this was a business that Jason was passionate about. He wanted a sort of a physiotherapy business that would care about the whole person and, would follow up with them, check in, how are you doing? How can we prevent, injury? There was never a franchise model in physiotherapy. So he did a lot of things that were different and had a huge impact. And so both of them were passionate about what they did, and both organizations helped a whole stack of people. But kind of what's remarkable about both Stephanie and Jason is that they both got out of their ventures and went on to do other things. But when they moved on, they were able to move on well because they didn't have their identities wrapped up in what they did. And it just floored me. I mean, they were off the charts passionate. I mean, how could you not be passionate about helping these 7 women and thousands of women in Nepal that have challenges and are marginalized? How can you not be passionate about it? And Stephanie was and is, but yet her identity wasn't wrapped up in it. How could you be Jason and have this vision of a new kind of physiotherapy network, but also not have your identity wrapped up in it? It's just like it floored me. It astounded me. It's like, how is that possible?
Yeah. And how they could do it. You and I could talk about how they could do it, but let's hear from them from the interviews that we did with them on the podcast. First, let's hear from Stephanie.
I've always wanted to encourage and uplift people and, help them to get a step close to their dreams and their goals. So that was when I met the 7 women, it was about helping them get set up in life. And I handed that over about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years now, to the local people. And that was always the plan after 17 years. So they're doing a great job at that, and they've got great hearts for their community. So I felt like I could trust them and hand it over. And, a lot of people said around that time, it's how do you feel handing your baby over? But I don't see it like that. It's like, no, there'll be the next place for me to make the next bit of impact. And it never defined me or who I was. That I've seen people where what they do really is their identity. And I think that's dangerous, because what if you get sick of it?
That was Stephanie. Here's Jason talking pretty much about the same subject.
Because I never wanted the business in the first place, because this actually wasn't my plan for my life, and I write about the cliche imposter syndrome that I struggled with for most of the 25 years I ran the business, it was almost relief when I sold it rather than a deconstruction of my identity. It was almost going back to my original identity formation, and that was, I've been through this 25-year adventure. It's developed my character. It's built resilience. I've learned something about scaling and leading teams and changing culture and facing hardship. And God's graduating me from the school of hard knocks. And now I'm returning to some real heartfelt passions, which sit as cornerstones in my identity.
So as you indicated, Warwick, before we played those clips, what they said about this issue in particular really had an impact on you. What's your reaction now hearing again what it is that they did indeed say when they were speaking to us?
Yeah, absolutely, Gary. I'm starting with Stephanie. As we can hear from that clip, it was never about her. It was never about her ego or identity. It was always about what ultimately were the thousands of women in Nepal who are marginalized that she wanted to empower. And this is despite the fact that she's achieved a fair amount of notoriety. She spoke in front of the United Nations. She received the Order of Australia, which is a very prestigious community award for exceptional conduct to the nation that I think was like a 2-year kind of examination to see if she is worthy of the award. The Order of Australia is not some small award, but yet none of this is really turned her head. And, she said that, she was never defined by what she did, which is just amazing. Like there'll be the next bit of impact, the next journey. It's dangerous if you have your identity wrapped up in what you do. And it's just, she's a humble yet driven person. And it was never about trying to make a name for herself. She saw a need on that trip to Nepal, and she wanted to help these 7 women and ultimately thousands of women. But it was just all about them, not about her. It was just amazing. And then with Jason's story is different in some ways. What's interesting about Jason is when he was thinking of selling Back in Motion, he's somebody that's always had people that mentored him in his life. He's always looked for mentors, which is really a huge lesson we can learn from him. He has become very involved as now chairman of an organization called Halftime that seeks to equip people to not just be successful, but lead lives of significance, which we obviously talk a lot about on Beyond the Crucible. So we had people walking alongside him, but it's ironic that one of the keys to his identity not being wrapped up in the business wasn't just mentoring. It was the fact that he never really wanted to get into this business in the first place.
Right. Right.
So it's like, you might be thinking, okay, but he's passionate about this business. He's had a huge impact, but he never wanted to do that. How's that square up? It's just like you can't square that circle. It makes no sense. Well, it's because this was never his plan for his life. He always, along with his wife, Paulina, had this vision of being a medical missionary in a developing nation. That was always the plan. That was always their plan. But yet he missed getting into medical school in Melbourne in Australia by a few marks, probably not much. And then his second option was physiotherapy. But that was always his second choice. It was never the vision. And ironically, throughout his time in Back in Motion, his business, he always struggled with letting go of the death of that original dream, which would be a whole other podcast of dealing with the death of the dream. But yet he felt like, gosh, and he's a person of faith, which we'll get to. And he always felt like, God, I had this vision of being a medical missionary in a developing nation. It didn't happen. And he just felt like it was second choice, second best. And it was a struggle for him. So in that sense, his identity, I don't know if it was being in a medical missionary. We didn't really get into that, but it certainly wasn't in the physiotherapy business. And so one of the keys, I think, which we'll unpack a bit more, is that for both Stephanie and Jason, they're people of faith, and they have their identity in something above, in this case, God. And so for them, when you have your identity in God and not in what you do, it's a lot easier to let go, because I'm not defined by what I do. I'm defined by a higher power, somebody above, in their case, God. But yet they believe passionately in the mission of what they were doing. But it's more, I think, for people of faith, what we do is an outgrowth of who we are and what we believe as children of God. And so it doesn't mean that we're justified by what we do. We're justified by our faith and our faith in God. And so it's easy to say, if you really live that, it makes it easier to not have your identity wrapped up in what you do, because that's not how you define who you are as a person and a human being. So that's really part of the keys to their story. But still in all, it is remarkable and astounding. It's one thing to have a set of beliefs you say you believe, but to live it out to the way they did, especially when the key is when they left their businesses, their ventures. They were fine. They moved on to other things. They're still having an impact, but they're not thinking, oh my gosh, I remember the glory days when I was in charge of 7 women. Right. I remember Back in Motion and, front cover of Business Week or, that kind of thing. It's like, no, that was great, but I moved on to the next venture, moved on to the next initiative, the next chapter of my story. I'm not defined by a chapter of my story. It's just incredible.
Yeah. And it's also interesting. And I think one of the things that makes it difficult, they were not defined by a chapter in their story, but they also weren't defined by success in their story, right? Stephanie spoke before the United Nations. Let me make sure I get the name right. The Order of Australia, she wins, which is, you've explained to me, is not that dissimilar to a knighthood is in England.
Right.
Jason sold his business for $100 million. It seems to me that it's, and I'll speak for myself, it's hard sometimes when accolades come your way, when success comes your way, the other S word that's not significance. When those things happen, that can be even harder, can't it, to not let your identity, and even more than your identity, your ego, sort of define who it is that you are. Success can make this a much, much, much harder slog, can't it?
Oh, it can. And we'll unpack this a bit. But basically, that's where is your ego and identity? Is it in what you do? Is it in a higher power, God, something above? That's the key. And when you can really walk that, Like for me, my perspective, and I think for many people of faith, if something happens, like, a few years ago, my book gets published, I'm like, I'm happy, I'm grateful, but I'm like, oh, glory to God, oh, glory to God. You actually see athletes on the field of play say the same thing. I heard my family tends to be Washington Commanders fans, and I recently heard the quarterback of the Washington Commanders who won the Heisman, I guess, a year ago or so. They had a spectacular win over the Cincinnati Bengals, and he said a lot of things and was humble, but he also included in that, all glory to God. I mean, that was an amazing comment. So when you can live that and not just say that, it is easier to say, hey, I'm just doing my part as a person of faith, as a person of God, child of God, and all glory to God. And there may be other ways of doing it, but certainly it's very helpful from that faith paradigm when you have that perspective to help deflect the accolades and the ego. And, here's the Washington Commanders playing Monday Night Football. It's national television. Scott Van Pelt is interviewing them. I mean, it's like a big deal. So, it's that soul work, which we'll get into, that is so helpful.
Yeah. As you do with every blog, and as we do with every podcast discussion about the blog, you have some points that you've written in this blog that's at beyondthecrucible.com. And we're going to sort of walk them out one at a time to help people apply some of the lessons that you've learned in your life, that you've learned from guests in the podcast, certainly from Stephanie and from Jason. And the first one of those points, Warwick, in your blog is to do some serious self-examination and reflection. What do you mean by that, and why is it important?
Yeah, absolutely, Gary. So I think as you listen to Stephanie and Jason, they teach us that before entering into a business or venture, you need to do some serious internal reflection and self-examination, especially if this is an initiative that you're off the charts passionate about. We believe that if you launch a vision here at Beyond the Crucible, we believe you need to be off the charts passionate about it. It kind of makes sense. But with being off the charts passionate, there can be dangers. And if you're just lukewarm about it, you don't really care, your identity probably is not going to be wrapped up in it, right? I really could care less if it succeeds or fails.
Right.
It probably will more likely fail in that case, but at least your identity won't be wrapped up in it. The trick is, what if you're off the charts passionate about a venture? That's when your identity can get wrapped up in it. So you need to ask yourself some questions such as, is this venture about serving others, about making an impact in the world? Or is it really more about my ego, and I'm looking for the praise and adulation of people? I'm looking for the Order of Australia or whatever that is in your country. I'm looking to speak at the United Nations. I'm looking to be on the front cover of Business Week as the most incredible man or woman of the century because, wow, they're brilliant. They're like, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos all rolled into one, better than all of them. I mean, whatever it is, Mother Teresa, Billy Graham, it's like, your ego can get pretty inflated with it all. I'm just, person of the century. So doing that self-examination and reflection beforehand is really critical. Is this about me, or is it about serving others? You got to be honest with yourself.
Yeah. And that's where, right, the answer to that question will tell you if you're pursuing a life of significance or a life of success, right? Which of the S roads are you going down? I think that's an important point. And it's a great place to start on this analysis of how you do this. Yeah,
just one more point. It's like, is your whole focus on being successful, or is it having a life of significance where it's focused on others? So that's part of what you're saying, Gary, which is a very good point.
Yeah. All right. Speaking of good points, here's your very good point 2 from your blog, which is called, I'm going to make sure I get it right. It's called, How Can You Avoid a Professional Identity Crisis? Do some soul work. That's over at beyondthecrucible.com, folks. The second point in that blog is this: if you weren't involved in the business, how would you feel? Why is that critical to ponder?
It really is, because imagine that you're involved in a business or you're about to launch it, and it either ends, goes bankrupt, you leave, you retire, If somebody else owns it, maybe you get fired. I mean, there's all sorts of different scenarios in which you can leave a business. If you say to yourself, gosh, if I wasn't involved in that business, I'd be seriously depressed. You know, who am I if I'm not CEO, executive director of this business or venture? If there's this sense of, hey, I'm going to be hitting retirement, or we're on a knife edge here and I don't know how it's going to go. Somebody might feel like it's my time to move on. If you have this sense of impending doom and your heart starts palpitating at the thought, that is a very bad sign that maybe your identity is wrapped up in what you're doing.
Yeah. And I don't think I've ever told you this before, but I had that very moment happen to me in the 90s. As listeners will know, if you heard the episode where you interviewed me, Warwick, about my history with alcoholism. When I checked myself into rehab, I quit my job as a managing editor of a paper in Texas. And I went into rehab, and I woke up the next morning and they delivered the paper to the rehab hospital. And I looked at the paper and the masthead is where they list all the executives, all the people who work on, in this case, the editorial board. And I opened it up and I saw that my name had been removed because I quit to go into rehab. And that sense of, wow, I'm holding the paper in my hand. It clearly came out. I'm not there anymore. It says right here, my name's not in the masthead. That was a real blow because my identity was wrapped up in being managing editor of this newspaper. I was riding that wave. And when that wave went away, in addition to all the other stuff I was dealing with, that was another crucible I had to sort of bounce forward from when it happened. So I know exactly what you're talking about when you say, if you weren't involved in the business, how would you feel? I felt pretty badly when that happened to me.
And to your point, Gary, you would have asked yourself, in a sense, who am I if I'm not the editor of this newspaper? Right. And when you ask yourself that question, it's like, I really don't know. That's a very scary place to be in, which you lived.
Yeah, for sure. The third point, folks, is this: ask some people for help. It's fascinating. As I'm reading through this now again, having told that story about myself, I'm like, that's exactly what I had to do when I got out of rehab. So point 3, ask some people for help. Talk about why that is so important.
You know, one of the keys, especially to Jason T. Smith's story, is that he has always looked for mentors. He's always looked for help as he was leading Back in Motion. More recently, he has become very involved with Halftime, which I've described, that really tries to help folks look at life not just about success, but about significance. But throughout his journey, he had a whole lot of challenges. There were times in which he had no margin. He was working 24 hours a day, which is common when you're starting a new business. But he wasn't just working 24 hours a day. He was very involved in his church, and it was, if there was any margin, it was sucked up by other activities, and there was hardly any. He had a tendency, as he would put it, to hire and trust the wrong people. And you listen to his podcast, because invariably his wife, Paulina, will say, Jason, I don't think that's the right person. And he'd say, no, this time it is. And he would jokingly say, after about, hundreds of times, you would think, well, I don't know, listen to my wife. But, some of us are, a little slow in that regard. So there were plenty of opportunities he had to seek advice from mentors, and he did. Doesn't mean he always listened every time, because we're all human. But so he had people to talk to about identity. And if he ever did have that temptation, and I'm not sure that he did, but if he ever did, he had people that would kind of press it into his life and saying, hey, Jason, you're talking a lot about I and me rather than the people you're serving. What's up with this? That's not like you. I mean, before it gets to be a 5-alarm fire, maybe if there were little embers, on the wood of your proverbial house, he had people that had the permission that he gave them just to lean in. So, I think having people alongside us, we call them fellow travelers in some ways. It also can include advisors. It can be really helpful in several different ways. It can help you avoid getting your identity wrapped up in what you do beforehand or while you're in it. Or if, like, Gary and me, you've had your identity wrapped up in what you do and somehow that business or venture ended, they can help bring you out of maybe, certainly for me, the pit of despair. And okay, so now who am I? Who am I if I'm not involved in the family business, or in your case, editor of that newspaper? So having advisors both before you get involved, while you're involved in that business, or after that ends, it can be so helpful.
Yeah, because especially if you surround yourself with people, right, who won't just tell you what you want to hear, but what you need to hear, right? That's a critical point, or people who will say, as you indicated, hey, dial back the ego a little bit, or it's not about you, or those kinds of things. People who have the permission to speak that kind of truth into your life can definitely help you avoid this. My identity is in what I do. And boy, look at what I'm doing. People who can bring you back down to earth, as we say. The fourth point of this blog, Warwick, and I have to mention this every time we do this because you do such a great job of stair-stepping here, right? Each one builds on the other, right? We go from do some serious self-examination and reflection. If you weren't involved in the business, how would you feel? Point 2. Point 3, ask some people for help. Point 4, if you find much of your ego or identity is wrapped up in what you do, be willing to get out. That one, it seems to me, of all the ones we've talked about so far, that one's hard, right? To be able to say, because like if I put myself in that situation before I went into rehab with the newspaper, I'd be like, am I willing to get out? No, I'm not willing to get out until I was sort of forced to get out. So if you find yourself and much of your ego and identity is wrapped up in what you do, be willing to get out. That's hard to do, but critical, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And both you, Gary, and I have lived that. We know this point better than we'd like to. I'll just include us both on that, if that's okay.
Yes.
So
party of two. Party of two we are.
Exactly right. Basically, if you're involved in a venture or initiative, if you ask yourself the question, would I be willing to get out? And you have heart palpitations as, there's no way. That's a very bad sign. That basically says your ego and identity is wrapped up in what you do. And in addition to all of the problems we've just mentioned, there is another one, is that if you put the business or organization first, or your ego, then it means it's not about serving the people that you said you're dedicating this whole business to. And what does that mean? And, what will the impact be on your organization, not just for the people that you're serving, but the people who are involved? Inevitably, when it's all about you, and it often can be about your ego, then how are you going to treat the people around you? Probably not well, certainly not as well as you could. So when the business is all about you and your identity and your ego, it tends to be very destructive for the people you're serving, destructive for your life, and destructive for your team members. So it's kind of a big deal. And so that's when you probably need to cycle back to the previous point about asking for help. If you feel like I can't get out because my whole sense of ego is wrapped up in it, then you need to go ask for some help.
Yeah. And it's, we've talked about pursuing success versus pursuing significance. But even if you make that choice to pursue significance, this can still become a problem, because when you're helping people, right? I mean, when you're helping, as Stephanie Woolard did, women who are marginalized, who have physical disabilities, and you're helping them live independently, that can get heady for you. When you're Jason T. Smith, who has this business, is helping restore health to folks, that can get heady for you. Sometimes even, and many times, even in a life of significance, as you're walking that out, this can be a danger, can't it? Because you're helping people, and that can puff you up even more. And certainly from people saying, you just do such great work with the people you help.
Oh, absolutely. I think of, there's a great book by C.S. Lewis, The Screwtape Letters. And basically it talks about how do you get people of the light, people of faith, as he puts it, off track. And it's often not through like a big Mack truck. Sometimes that's in some strange irony, that's easier to withstand. But I've often thought one of the hardest things to withstand is praise. You know, like, hey, Warwick, I love what you do at Beyond the Crucible. Gary, I love what you do. That's so great. And it's nice to hear affirmation, or the work you do with Focus on the Family. For instance, man, that story you did, or that press release, or that promotion, that is so meaningful. And wow, that was so impactful. That was just incredible. It's nice of them, but, you know, it can be hard to withstand praise and accolades. That's often the hardest thing to withstand in terms of ego and identity. So, yeah.
Yeah, especially when it's tied up in helping other people, right? It's not all about the money you're making. It's about the lives that you're improving. That makes it even slippery for you.
Absolutely.
And that's why point 5 in your blog that we're going to talk about next is so critical. This, I think, is the fulcrum on which this all turns. And that is this, quite simply, do some soul work. You use that phrase a lot, Warwick, soul work. What is it, and why is it so important to do as you're stepping your way through these stairs about making sure you don't have a professional identity crisis?
That is a great question, Gary. Really, this is maybe the heart of it, is doing some soul work. And that can mean different things for different people. For people of faith, with a belief in God, obviously that has one connotation. For people with beliefs that are broader than that, I think that's still very relevant. One of, if not the key to Stephanie and Jason's stories, was their faith. In particular, their faith in God. They believed that their initiatives was not about them. It was all about a greater good, serving a higher power. From day one, their identity was not in what they did, it's one thing to say their identities were in what they did, and then they got some help from advisors or some prayer, and they got back on the straight and narrow. That was not the case. And so when they got out of their ventures, it wasn't a tough shift. You know, they moved on to the next initiative where they could have impact. So the fact that Stephanie and Jason had their identity in a higher power, and what they did was just, in a sense, from a faith perspective, them being obedient to the mission they felt that God had put on their heart. And in the case of Jason, it was really wrestling with it, saying, you know, Lord, I don't want to do this. I want to be a medical missionary. But ultimately, he had a sense that this is what God wanted him to do, and said, okay, Lord, it certainly wouldn't be my choice, but I realize you feel like I can help a whole bunch of people with physiotherapy rather than, nothing against being a medical missionary, but this is the path you've laid out for me. I'm going to say yes. But it was a struggle and a wrestle, but doing that in a soul work and having your sense of identity in something above, whatever that means to you, that's key. Certainly was key for Stephanie and Jason. It cannot be overstated. That inner soul work is key. It can provide, I don't know about the antidote, we're humans and nothing is foolproof, but it certainly can be an enormous help doing that inner soul work to help prevent your identity and ego being wrapped up in what you do, and inevitably then polluting the core of what you might believe is a sacred calling or mission, and hurting your team and hurting others, which is almost inevitable if you have your identity and ego wrapped up in what you do.
Yeah, so true. And the 6th point in the blog sort of is a way to sort of cement that soul work, right? It's a way to not just cement it, but keep it moving ongoing. The 6th point in the blog, folks, is every day pray or meditate to whatever higher power you believe in. So you've done the soul work. Now you want to make sure the soul work doesn't seep out, doesn't slip out. And this is a way to kind of set it. This is a way to keep it set, keep it moving. Talk about the importance of that.
Continually ask yourself, whatever initiative or task you're doing today, what's my heart? What's my motive? Is it about me, or is it about the people I'm serving, or serving some greater good, serving some higher power? It's that daily heart examination. It's pretty much daily exercise and diet. That's where the battle is won and lost, is that day-to-day self-examination, because we're all capable of getting off the rails and, doing something that's not helpful to us or to others. every day it's a battle.
Yeah. And when that happens, folks, you could find yourself in a professional identity crisis. And Warwick's blog at beyondthecrucible.com, there right now, you can visit it right after you're done listening to us, is how can you avoid a professional identity crisis? Do some soul work. That's the name of the blog. We have so far gone through here 6 of his 7 points. First point is do some serious self-examination and reflection. Second point is if you weren't involved in the business, how would you feel? Third point, ask some people for help. After those first 2 things, you're going to need to ask some people for help. The fourth point, if you find that much of your ego or identity is wrapped up in what you do, be willing to get out. Fifth point, do some hard soul work. 6th point, we've got a lot of points here. 6th point, every day, pray or meditate on whatever higher power you believe in, which leads us to the final point in the blog, and that's number 7. And I love this. I've said a similar thing to what I'm about to say you wrote for a couple of decades now. And that's this, Warwick. You wrote, remember that not only are you not defined by your worst day, but you are not defined by your best day. I've phrased it as I am more than my worst day and less than my best day. Why is that perspective a good, critical, important thing that sort of circumnavigates this whole discussion we've been having?
Yeah, I mean, challenges to identity can come from your worst days or your best days. And I think as we were talking a bit, some days you get these accolades like Stephanie Woolard, she gets to speak to the United Nations. She gets the Order of Australia. There can be times in which you feel like I'm pretty hot stuff. I'm like amazing. I am the GOAT, the greatest of all time in my industry, in my profession, in my town. I'm like pretty amazing. And you might be good at what you do, which is fine. But, that's when you got to realize on the days when you feel like you're the greatest person that's ever lived, you may not be. And then on other days you feel like, gosh, I really failed. I kind of spoke harshly to the people at work. I didn't really serve my customers or people that I'm trying to serve that well because, today it was all about me. That's not who I am. That's not who I want to be. But today it was all about me. I failed. I really let down myself. I let down my team. I let down the people I'm trying to serve. Okay. You got to forgive yourself and, do the requisite, conversations that you might need to apologize or to say, yeah, sorry, yesterday wasn't my greatest day. I kind of was kind of all about me or, whatever you feel like is the right tone or right phrases you need to do. So yeah, there's going to be days that you feel like were great days and, you get your head in the clouds and, hey, look at me, I'm hot stuff. Other days you think, man, I failed, and you have the opposite reactions. Realize life's a journey. Some days are going to be better than others in terms of where your identity is. And so really that's where, as we've said before, doing that daily inner soul work, whether it's prayer, meditation, whatever, you feel works for you, as well as having trusted advisors who you can talk to saying, I sense that yesterday wasn't great. I feel like it was all about me. And maybe if they know you well enough, even if you don't call them, maybe they kind of have their tabs on what you're doing. Maybe it's like, I've kind of heard that you kind of were really,
right,
kind of full of yourself that day, So having those trusted advisors have the backstage pass can be helpful. The inner soul work and trusted advisors can help you get over that roller coaster of my worst day, my best day. Either of those days, best day or worst day, can, help your identity get off track, ironically.
Yeah. Did you say have a backstage pass, like a backstage pass to your life? I've never heard that expression before. And just so you know, and we have witnesses of all the listeners and viewers, I'm going to steal that for my own use because that's great.
And in all fairness, that wasn't my phrase. I mean, I've heard that a number of times. Maybe it's more in a church spiritual context. I've heard people say people have the backstage pass to your life, can ask you tough questions. So that's not my phrase. In all full disclosure. but it's a good.
Well, whomever it belongs to, I'm going to steal it now. And you have heard, listeners, viewers, you have heard and seen me say that. All right. So you may remember also that earlier when we started this conversation, I said we would come back to Warwick's story, because Warwick talked early in this episode about how his identity was all wrapped up when he launched the takeover. Even before he launched the takeover of the family media business, his whole life, his identity was wrapped up in being a critical part of John Fairfax Limited. But now, Warwick, things are different. And so talk a little bit about what you do now at Beyond the Crucible, and to what degree your identity is or is not wrapped up in what you do.
Yeah, Gary, listening to those podcasts with Stephanie Willard and Jason Smith, and as we were talking to them at the time, as I mentioned, it caused me to reflect a lot about the issue of identity. And it's interesting, it made me realize how much my identity was wrapped up in the family business when I was involved in it, as the heir apparent to this 150-year-old, massive family dynasty, having the premier media assets in newspapers, TV, and radio in Australia. Clearly, my identity was all wrapped up in being the heir apparent and not disappointing my dad and my parents and the founder of the company, my great-great-grandfather, John Fairfax. But then as I reflect on what we do at Beyond the Crucible, it's kind of different, because I feel like my identity is actually not wrapped up in what I do at Beyond the Crucible. And it's not that I don't care. I care passionately about what we do to help people bounce back from their worst day. They're not defined by it, to help them live lives of significance, lives on purpose, dedicated to serving others. I'm passionate about what we do. I love learning from other folks. I love reflecting. I love these kinds of discussions. The work I did in my book, Crucible Leadership, I care passionately about it, but I'm not defined by it. I'm focused on how can we have a greater impact on the people we serve? How can we as a team collectively have that impact on others and their lives? So that's really, what I'm completely focused on. And one of the interesting things as I was reflecting, as listeners probably know, I'm a very reflective person, which has its pluses and minuses. But hopefully in this, there's a plus. As a person of faith, it won't surprise you that I pray often, throughout the day, but certainly at least once a day, typically as I'm about to go to bed and, fall asleep. And I just have my own pattern. We all have different patterns. There's no one way of doing it. For me, I'm very thankful to God and having Jesus in my life. I always start with that. Then I say how thankful I am for my wife, Gail. We've been married this year 35 years, and given that my dad was married 3 times, and I was from the third marriage, obviously I don't take that for granted. I'm very thankful for that, and the wonderful wife I have, and my 3 wonderful kids. And then I also am thankful for what I call meaningful work. And so I would just list the things I was involved in. What's fascinating is, as I'm listing those things, Beyond the Crucible wasn't the first thing. It was like towards the end, if not the last. And it's not like I don't care.
Right.
It's just there are a number of things that I am or have been involved in. Like I'm an elder at my non-denominational church. I was on the board for many years of my kids' school, which is a Christian school. My kids went to Taylor University, a faith-based university. I involved with that and, other initiatives. I remember thinking to myself, that's actually not a bad sign that, Beyond the Crucible wasn't first on the list. So recently I thought, you know what? Given how much work I'm involved with, it's okay for me to bump it a little bit higher, at least than last, maybe towards the front. That doesn't mean I'm selling my soul, to, the evil one or whatever, or however you look at it. But the fact that it wasn't number one, it's sort of like, well, gosh, that's actually a pretty good sign. So it encouraged me a lot.
Yeah. And I'll sort of pile on and say I have too, certainly since I was in a rehab hospital room, looking at the newspaper masthead to see if my name was in there. I very much love the work that I do, both for Beyond the Crucible and some other clients, all other clients. I like the work I do for all of them. But for me, and what comes to mind is something that happened a couple nights ago. It was a very, very, very busy day, right? I was running. And my stepdaughter, Alyssa, asked me to pick up some photographs from her at Walgreens. And I had a prescription there. I'm like, sure, no problem. Well, I go there, and after like 5 minutes, they finally locate the fact that it's at a different Walgreens, because like every city in Kenosha, Wisconsin, Walgreens are every like 37 feet. There's a Walgreens, right? So it was another Walgreens. And so I went and got him and I brought him home, and I texted her and she was like, oh, well, no, I'll get him. I'm like, no, it's fine. But when I came home after that very long day, it got a little longer because I was going from Walgreens to Walgreens. I gave her pictures. That's what she needed. I gave her pictures and I looked her right in the eyes and I said, you don't understand. I love you. I would go to Milwaukee to get you your photographs if you needed your photographs. And that talking about all this here shows me my priorities are in the right order. That, I had a hard day at work and I don't drink anymore, but boy, I could sit down and watch the Cubs game or whatever. No, I went out, I was doing some things, and I did something to help my family. And that's where my heart is at too on a daily basis. So I hear what you're saying when you talk about that.
Very well said. You had your identity in the right place.
Yeah.
It's living out what you believe, loving your family, loving God. And that's what it looks like day to day. Well said.
Yeah. I mean, my wife and I just bought a new house. This is my home office I'm in right now. And the biggest room in the house is the family room. And it's on the walls are pictures of family, because we wanted to make that a place that is reserved for the thing that's most important to us. All right, we've landed the plane now on discussing the blog, but we haven't landed the plane on the entire conversation, and because we always want to leave people with what is your perspective that they can take from this. So, Warwick, what is the one truth, the one important thing from this blog, from this discussion about this blog that you'd like to leave with listeners and viewers?
Yeah, I think the key is realizing the danger of having your identity wrapped up in what you do. To use that phrase, to be forewarned is to be forearmed. If you haven't started your business yet, do some serious self-examination, some serious soul work. Make sure this business that you're about to launch is about serving others, not about you. If it's like, you know what, I don't really care about the people I'm serving, it's all about me, then don't do it. Stop. Avoid hurting other people. Avoid hurting the people that you seek to serve. Go back and do some serious soul work, get some advisors, basically to the degree that you need to, get your life together, get your ego and identity in check, do some soul work first. Your family, your prospective team members, those that you're willing to serve, they'll be grateful if you do that. So if you've already gotten involved in that business, you've got to try to ensure that your identity is not in what you do. And maybe you feel like, well, you know what? It's about, it's more about me than I'd like to admit. I've got my identity pretty wrapped up in this business. I didn't realize it. I do now. So that's when you need to do, as I've said before, some soul work and to get some advisors like Jason Smith did and help try to figure out, well, how did we get here? How come maybe I had good motives to help people, but how did we get to this point where it's all about me? Do some serious reflection, begin to think about, well, what is it I believe? What's the anchor for my soul? Is it God? Is it some different paradigm? Am I even living what I believe? Often I find it's not so much people are believing in bad things, so to speak. More often, they're not living in light of what they say they believe. That's far more the common reason. If that's the case, it's not about, oh, you have bad beliefs. You're just not living them. Well, gosh, that should be a problem for most people. So what do I need to do to get back on track to living what I believe? And part of that's inner soul work, daily prayer and meditation, but also talking to advisors that will help you. Remember, ultimately, you want your business to be about serving others and not to be about you. When you make it about you, you have much less chance of serving others and making a positive impact. You got to ask yourself, is that what you really want? To have the business be all about you, to cause fractured relationships with your family, your team members, and with those you're willing to serve. Rather than the dream being this wonderful dream to help people, it will come crashing down and be a dream that's all about you, that'll hurt everybody that you love and care about, your family, your team members, and your customers and those you're willing to serve. And again, you got to ask yourself, is that who you really want to be?
That was a perfect landing of the plane, Warwick. That was a perfect landing of the plane of this discussion. And I will have the temerity as one of your fellow travelers to say, you're good at this. So you can move up like maybe one or two. You can move beyond the Crucible up, as you indicated earlier, just a couple of places, not knocking out the most important stuff. But I think it can go up a couple of places.
Yeah, well said.
And folks, we've got, as we always do, as Warwick always does in his blogs, he has questions of reflection, things that you can think about, ask yourself about, probe, not just about this discussion, but about his blog over at beyondthecrucible.com. And here's the first point of reflection. How much of your ego is wrapped up in the mission or cause you are pursuing? Mull that question over. Write some things down. Take your time. Don't just do the first couple things that come to mind. Take it some time over a period of time to make sure you're capturing everything as it comes to you. Second point for reflection, how important is this mission or cause to those your organization serves? That's a critical point, right? What would happen if your organization didn't exist, or if it was existing in a way that was impacted by your identity crisis? So how important is this mission or cause to those your organization serves? Think about that. And then the third point, are you willing to get out of this venture or not pursue it if you can't get your ego in check? That one could leave a mark as you think about that one. That's a good one to ponder. That's that deep soul work that Warwick is talking about. Are you willing to do the inner soul work so that you can make your cause or mission truly about the people you serve and not about you? Some excellent points of reflection. We encourage you to really dive in. Start a notebook for when we have these kinds of episodes, on every episode, because there's always questions that come out of that. Start a notebook, write things down of how points are affecting you, impacting you. And certainly if any of these points that we've talked about have struck a chord with you, have helped you see some things you didn't see before, or you have questions about them, we encourage you to drop us a line at info@beyondthecrucible.com. So until the next time we're together, folks, remember this truth. We know that Crucible experiences are painful. We know sometimes we can contribute to them. Sometimes people bring them upon us. Whatever the circumstances that surround them, we know they're difficult, but we also know they're not the end of your story. They weren't the end of Warwick's story. They weren't the end of my story. They were not the end of Jason T. Smith's story or Stephanie Woolard's story. For them and for you, they can be the launching point to a whole different destination. If you learn the lessons from them, you apply those lessons, where you can be taken, where your journey will take you is to a life of significance. Welcome to a journey of transformation with the Beyond the Crucible assessment. Unlike any other, this tool is designed to guide you from adversity to achievement. As you answer a few insightful questions, you won't just find a label like the helper or the individualist. Instead, you'll uncover your unique position in the journey of resilience. This assessment reveals where you stand today, the direction you should aim for, and crucially, the steps to get there. It's more than an assessment. It's a roadmap to a life of significance. Ready? Visit beyondthecrucible.com. Take the free assessment and start charting your course to a life of significance today.